Welcome to the International Peace Institute. I'm Andrea O'Sullivan, a policy analyst here at IPI. Together with our partner for this event, the Permanent Mission of Liechtenstein, I thank you for joining us during what is still a busy time of the year for this opportunity to discuss the theme of the upcoming Security Council open debate on women, peace, and security, the effects of forced displacement for women refugees and IDPs. Women make up the majority of the world's displaced population, a number that passed 50 million people last year. For example, of the 3 million Syrian refugees living in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Turkey, 4 out of 5 are women or children. This morning, we convened a closed-door roundtable on women and forced migration for member states' women, peace, and security experts. Among other topics, we discussed trends like rising urbanization, increases in violent extremism, and the changing nature of conflict, how these trends impact forcibly displaced women and girls, and what international responses are required. This afternoon, we're happy to continue this important conversation with all of you. Without further delay, I'll turn over to our co-host and moderator of today's event, Ambassador Christian Venevasser, Permanent Representative of Liechtenstein to the United Nations. Under his leadership, Liechtenstein plays a vocal role at the UN in advocating for the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda across the pillars of protection and participation. Ambassador Venevasser is a long-term friend of IPI, bringing attention to key issues from international justice, accountability, and the International Criminal Court to reform of the UN and the multilateral system. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you all for coming to IPI for this lunch discussion. There has been a workshop already on this issue this morning, and we are happy to see that so many of you have found a way here to IPI. Andrea has mentioned that we are doing this event in preparation, in particular, of the open debate that will take place in the Security Council later this month. And we do hope that the discussions here can be fed into the open debate. As you know, there's an opportunity, of course, for all states to participate in the discussions. At times, these are rather stale affairs with people coming in, repeating known positions that they have taken in the past. And we do hope that perhaps the discussions here give you some ideas on what you could contribute, what your countries could contribute to the open debate at the end of the month, because we do believe that the topic we are discussing here is really of particular relevance under several aspects. One is, of course, the women, peace, and security angle, which for us as a mission is one of our priority topics and themes. But we also think that the topic of displacement in general is extremely important to be highlighted, and in particular, the situation of internally displaced persons. So we're very happy to have this opportunity here and to have this excellent panel. I will give the floor to the speakers in the order they are listed in the program. So our first speaker is Hans-Jörg Strohmeyer, who is, of course, from OCHA. You probably all know him. He's the Chief of Policy Development and Studies, and he has a long history with this particular topic, and we look forward to hearing from you. Hans-Jörg, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christian. And first of all, thanks to Liechtenstein and IPI for taking the initiative. Needless to say that this is very timely, not only because of the open debate, but also because we have an unprecedentedly high number of IDPs in the world, and the numbers are increasing by the day, sadly so. This also will lead to unprecedented opportunities in the post-2015 SDG discussions, and I'll come to that a little later. Just on the figures, unprecedented figures. It's at the end of 2013, IDMC, that is supported by the Norwegian Refugee Council, has estimated that there are 33 million people living in internal displacement caused by conflict and violence. You have to add to that, that is the figure at the end of 2013, and if you look at the different contexts that we've had this year, further in the Middle East, the Ukraine and so on, we have probably added significant numbers to that. So on top of those 33 million, you have 22 million displaced in 119 countries, primarily in Asia, due to sudden onset disasters, natural disasters, as we usually refer to them. So that makes a number of 55 million displaced. And the trend, the tendency is a little less so in natural disasters than in conflict, that the core of those people will never return to their places of origin, or only after a very long time. The average duration of displacement in conflict settings is 17 and a half years. That includes those who have an opportunity, but also those many for whom displacement, the moment it occurs, is a life sentence. They will never be able to go back. And that's why most fundamental, we believe, and that's a point that we've been trying to impress in the course of the ongoing SDG post-2015 discussions, that displacement and forced displacement is very often taken for being a humanitarian issue. It's an issue for OCHA, it's an issue for UNHCR, for IOM, and many others. But we should turn it around. Yes, it is in the first instance an issue very often when it occurs for these organizations, but it actually is a long-term development issue. That's where the emphasis is placed, and that's where the biggest gap exists in terms of finances and ways forward. We have several speakers here who will say much more about the specific impacts on the role of women, but let me just give you a few examples. And it's a truism, we've been saying this for many years, we mustn't think of women only as victims in these contexts, but also as agents of change, and there are opportunities in this. But it is estimated, no one has the correct figures, but it's estimated that 80% of the displaced populations from conflict are women and children. The explanations are relatively obvious. Men either have joined the fight or hide for fear of recruitment or stay behind in their houses or the land to mine those places. So the majority of displaced in camp settings or in urban settings are in fact women and children. And that turns women into very different, gives them very different roles. All of a sudden they find themselves in the role of the head of a household, having to be the breadwinner. And I just came back from a conference, as I said, that the IRC hosted on urban displacement, and there was a very impressive video shown where they interviewed a number of forcibly displaced and asked them about their needs. This was in urban settings. And the first one was rent. Rent. Where do I get the rent to pay for the apartment? Every single woman said that as their number one issue. The second one was food, and the third one was school. How do I get my children to? It gives us a different idea of what their concerns are. It's not everyday water, food, and this. It is actually those very socioeconomic factors, particular in urban settings, which are on the rise. Overall, I think 2/3 of displaced live in urban settings and not in camp settings. So our idea of what to do programmatically with IDPs, displaced persons, is very much shaped by the pictures that we've very often seen of camps, big camps. And that is not necessarily the idea. Why is that important? It's important to understand that what you need to do in terms of support may differ very much between those two situations. We found that because of those changing roles of women, they may face opportunities in their personal life, but they also may face disadvantages that are connected to their previous perception and their role in their society. They may be discriminated upon in terms of standing in line for institutions, for documents, for food delivery, for all of these things, which then in turn has an impact on the people serviced by them. But we will probably hear much more and more expertly from our colleagues here. Let me just go back to the issue of the longer term, the 17 years. We had an area formula meeting earlier this year in April or May that was hosted by Australia and Chile for the Security Council members, but many others. Some or many of you may have been there. And it was interesting. We were trying to impress the exact same point to the Security Council members. This is a long-term issue. The moment displacement occurs, you need to think about those 17 years. Don't just let it happen and say, there are humanitarian agencies, let them take care of it. You need to impress on the national government, on the parties to the conflict, on the municipalities involved, that they need to start thinking about, and the organizations involved, and to support them, you need to think about the strategy. And not only too often we think about their strategy for return, because that's what they want in that moment. But the reality is that they may be there for a very long time. So we have to start looking at what is the institutional framework, what is the institutional capacity in a country, in a municipality on top of it, to respond. We found in Afghanistan, many other places, yes, that national policies and frameworks have been put in place, but they amount to an authority with a few people somewhere at capital level. But the people who really have to struggle with this are the people at the municipal level, where the support systems of service delivery and public services are overwhelmed. They cannot cope with this. And so very often IDPs are excluded. And what this leads to, particularly in urban settings, in urban environments, and with those women and children being the majority, that they're handed down the food chain or the economic chain to form the basis of those urban poor. And that is why we believe, and we've been advocating for the fact that displacement, internal displacement, or forced displacement, including refugees, is a fundamental issue in the post-2015 SDG environment. You will not have peaceful societies unless you deal with those 55 million displaced people. And on the other hand, you will not be able to deal with them if you don't invest differently and long-term into the institutional capabilities and capacities of those countries affected. And too often still, this is where the gap lies. There is no real funding stream. It's not recognized really as a developmental issue, or too little. National authorities, their first instinct too often still is to say, well, you own it, you international community, you own this issue. We take care of the many other people that we have to take care with. Worse for refugees than it is for displaced persons, but still. So 2 or 3 additional points. What are the biggest challenges that we believe exist? It is, as I said, at that national level, that there are too little policy frameworks or coordination systems, particularly nationally or municipally owned, that we can support, but that mustn't be owned by us. They must be locally owned. There's a lack of comprehensive IDP registration. Very often IDPs themselves don't want to register until there's a very clear incentive for them to get something out, connected to services and so on. Otherwise, it is perceived as a form of control. And of course, host communities. I mean, many host communities are totally overwhelmed by the issue of the reception of IDPs. But there's an important point there for all of us to consider. We mustn't reduce the response to IDPs just to one of service delivery. The thing that really makes IDPs is their status, is their lack of access to documentation, is their lack of legal status, and these types of issues that sometimes for very good and political reasons are not being clarified. So while we have done much more and better on providing assistance and services to IDPs for many, many years, this has led to these situations of protracted, or contributed to these situations of protracted displacement, where people are kept alive, but nothing ever changes about their status and their actual situation that has made them displaced. And again, recollecting that 80% of those displaced are women and children. Those are the most affected by this. On the programmatic side, and that's the last thing, we have a great lack of accurate data. So I said an estimated 80% is women and children, but we don't have granularity in terms of the data. We don't have sex and age disaggregated data by region. So it's very difficult, not only for our comprehension of the problem, but also ultimately to design the right programs that are fit for the right people. So more needs to happen there. There are reasons for why this is difficult, but more needs to happen there. Very last point is, I mentioned the Security Council. It's quite interesting. We had a bit of did a bit of an assessment over the last few years of the language that exists in Security Council resolutions. And I made the same point at the AREA Formula meeting half a year ago. While the issue of IDPs is not new to the Security Council over the last 15 years, but very often it is language that sounds like blah, 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 the displacement of significant numbers of civilians, the displacement of tens of thousands of civilians, and these types of things. We're concerned about civilians, in particular, women, children, the youth, displaced, and it's these things that ultimately are devoid of any concrete meaning. You put it there because it is a feature of the conflict, but it doesn't lead to anything substantial. The language of the Security Council in these resolutions needs to change from the start. It needs to recognize that displacement is a long-term problem. It needs to encourage those actors on the ground, the parties first and foremost, to work on nationally owned solutions, strategies, and plans. And it needs to prompt donors to invest in these things. There are a few encouraging examples in the DRC and Somalia, and Mali, where the Council has gone in this direction and offered more concrete and action-oriented language. I would suggest that this is something that we need to exploit further and address. So in summary, I think there is a lot that the different communities have to do more. On the agency side, I would think one of the main points is that on the delivery side, particularly in these increasing urban settings, we need to learn how to link up much, much better with the municipal levels, not to reduce it to service delivery, but aim at including IDPs into the service delivery rather than creating a parallel system, as it were, of ongoing, endless humanitarian deliveries that basically establish a parallel system to the one that municipalities have established or should be establishing for their services. On the Security Council, I mentioned, I think much earlier, recognition of the longevity and the severity of the problem, its institutional and stability implications, and urge the parties to take appropriate steps, particularly invest in their national and municipal institutions, have strategies and plans. And on the longer term, the SDG point that I made before, the recognition of a target or indicators in the post-2015 draft, which is not the case presently, despite everything that we just said. So we have to work even harder to get there. But it will be very important in the post-2015 SDGs to have either a target or indicators across several sectors that allow us to be, for the SDG framework, to also be transformative vis-à-vis IDPs. If they drop off, then the monitoring of these indicators and targets and goals will never include IDPs. And then the funding streams, which will be prioritized around these new SDGs, will just leave funding of IDPs to those who fund it today. It will never invest adequately into the longer term. That's why we believe it is a very critical issue, and it is a universal issue that can appear displaced displacement everywhere. Displacement hits anywhere in the world, not only in sub-Saharan Africa or in some of these contexts that we have in mind. It hits in Europe, it hits massively in East Asia, in many other places. So it is for us a universal issue. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Hans-Jörg, in particular for linking this also to the SDG agenda, where we and others had fought without success, I admit, for the inclusion of IDPs in the targets of Goal 16, which we find to be one of the deficiencies of the text as it currently stands. But thanks also for your very concrete comments on established Security Council language, which perhaps is something that people on the Council in particular can look at in connection with the upcoming open debate. And we are moving to our next speaker, Jenny Minson from the International Rescue Committee. Jenny.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting the International Rescue Committee to be here today, and thank you to my colleagues for ensuring that women and girls are front and center and that their voices are being heard and represented. I want to spend my time today actually talking about a report that was just released by the IRC, Are We Listening? And it's a report that gathers information, data over 3 years worth of data from programs that the IRC runs in the region. And it is a regional report that includes 5 countries. And it also includes qualitative data where we spoke with women, girls, and men. And based on that, we came up with a number of recommendations, but we also outlined in clear detail what many of these women and girls are facing today as a result of the conflict. Since 1996, the IRC has designed and implemented programs to respond to the needs of women and girls in over 33 conflicts around the world, including since 2007 in the Middle East, and then for the last 3 years in the Syria region specifically. We wrote this report to amplify the voices of women and girls in the Syria region and to galvanize the international community to action, to bring the interest of women and girls who are disproportionately impacted by conflict from the margins of service provision to the mainstream of humanitarian programming. Our very first recommendation in the report is to really put women and girls front and center, to listen to what they're telling us, but not just to listen, to include them in the program design and accessing services to make them a part of the solutions. Because we know from research, we know from experience, when that happens, real durable solutions can occur. As I mentioned, this data was based on 3 years of programming information that we collected, but we also conducted interviews with 198 Syrian women and girls and men, and we did that through individual interviews as well as in focus groups. Our main findings are that women and girls face multiple forms and the constant threat of daily violence, which we know this in general, but what we found specifically is that the impact and the severity of this is great. I want to read a quote, part of a quote from a young Syrian woman who is in Jordan right now, expressing her experience of what this conflict has done. Even in my own home, I can't escape the harassment. I'm afraid when I'm outside with the door locked. I'm afraid when I'm inside with the door locked. Strange men call my cell phone, trying to engage me in conversation or solicit me. The result is incredible daily stress and growing depression. I feel like I am choking. Unfortunately, this was a recurrent theme that we found based on these interviews. There's a lot of depression and hopelessness that is setting in. Women and girls are not only afraid to leave the house, but they're also reporting higher rates of domestic violence and violence inside the home as well. In fact, more than 70% of violent incidents reported to the IRC staff happened in refugees' homes. Of those incidents, 80% were perpetrated by an intimate partner or someone known to the victim. Domestic violence is an issue that has yet to be embraced by the humanitarian community more fully, but yet it is one that we hear repeatedly being a primary issue and challenge and concern and threat to the livelihood and well-being of women and girls. The vast majority of women and girls spoke about increasingly facing sexual harassment and exploitation outside their homes as well. They were reluctant to seek help or to report it, fearing for their safety or the safety of their families, deportation, or community retaliation. Adolescent girls are being married at younger ages and higher rates due to economic pressures, little to no option for education, broken social networks and families intent to preserve their honor in the face of daily threats of sexual harassment and abuse. So again, some of these issues are known within a broader context, but specific to this conflict, these issues are getting compounded and they're becoming worse every day. Girls are getting married off at younger ages. Finally, there is a massive gap between policy and practice when it comes to protecting women and girls. Governments, UN agencies, international NGOs have been strong on rhetoric but weak on follow-through with devastating consequences. This is why the IRC in this new report demands a major rethink in service delivery and prioritization, calling for the interest of women and girls to finally move from the margins of service provision to the mainstream of humanitarian programming. I can't emphasize that piece enough. We know that when women and girls are informing the process, are informing their own sense of security, they can help to not only secure themselves, but the ultimate effect is helping to rebuild communities as well as securing children's futures. So if we know these things, I think that it's important, and IRC holds itself accountable as well, by the way. These recommendations are for us too. It's very important that we really start to up the ante and have a much higher benchmark or watermark on how we're holding ourselves accountable. We do have a lot of guidelines, and we've got tremendous momentum and tremendous focus and dedication from many agencies and partner agencies and collaboration. We have guidelines for what we do on the ground in emergencies, but we have to really make sure that we're implementing them. This report really highlights that they're not being heard. They are not being listened to. And now is the time. We can make a significant difference and a significant impact if we can make this shift together as a community.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny. And I'll go to our last speaker. Nahla is from UN Women, and she is from the Peace and Security section. Nahla, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you to the Mission of Liechtenstein and to IPI for organizing this event today and for highlighting this issue. And I don't know if we have a representative from the Argentinian mission here, but should say thank you to the Argentinian mission as presidents of the Council this month for choosing this issue and for providing us with the opportunity to really highlight what has been a gap area. And I want to start with that and say that, as my colleagues have noted, this has been an issue that has too infrequently been dealt with in front of the Security Council. And where it really has been approached as a purely humanitarian and I would say increasingly, to some extent, a development issue. But not enough focus has been on displacement as a peace and security issue, and very little attention has been on this issue through a women, peace and security lens. And this is a gap that I think has been increasingly pointed to in the last few years, and to some extent last year during the annual Women, Peace and Security debate of the Council adopted Resolution 2122, which begins to address some of these gap areas to an extent. And 2122 notes in particular the issues of unequal citizenship rights and laws in countries of origin, of unfair access to asylum determination processes for women, of the issues that are raised by lack of access to ID documents, but also noting that women experience the full range of human rights violations during conflict, and they experience them differently as a result of pre-existing gender inequalities. And one of the violations specifically mentioned is that of forced displacement, which is a crime under international law, and we have yet to see it prosecuted as such, but has very specific gender or has very specific implications for women and girls. So it's a gap area that has been noted in the last few years that increasing attention has been paid to. But it's also, as colleagues have noted, this year particularly important. We are seeing unprecedented levels of displacement and refugee flows. During the debate on October 28th, UN Women's Executive Director will present the annual Secretary General's report on women, peace, and security to the Council, and this will be one of the issues that will be highlighted, is the unprecedented flows of displacement and the impact that it's having on women and girls in particular. And this is complicated also by the fact that we're seeing the changing nature of conflict at the moment, and also the changing nature of roles of different actors. And I think South Sudan is one of the countries that we can look to in particular on the changing nature of the role of the UN system in relation to what's happening in the camps there. But I think also the changing nature of conflict itself. We're seeing protracted conflict in Syria, in South Sudan, in CAR, but we're also now seeing complications and a global threat by the rise of violent extremism. And that is driving new population flows and is also creating new challenges in terms of how we respond. And I'll return to that issue in a little bit to talk about these new challenges. I think for us, for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the issue of women and girls and of refugees and IDPs is incredibly emblematic. It shows us the progress that we have made in implementing the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but it actually points very concretely to the challenges in implementation and the inadequate implementation that we have had to date. It also shows us the relationship, the full nature of the gendered impact of conflict on women and girls. And I'll give you just one example. We've heard examples from Syria about sexual violence, about domestic violence. We know that the rise of violence as a result of flight and displacement takes many forms. Sexual violence, the rise of violence in the home, sexual abuse and exploitation, survival sex, as well as early and forced marriage. This is not unique to Syria. These are forms of violence that we are seeing in all of the situations of displacement. But we can also see the way in which this is complicated and how women and girls' experiences of flight, displacement, and return are complicated by pre-existing gender inequalities. So the vulnerability to sexual and gender-based violence during flight and displacement is concretely a result of gender discrimination, in terms of how we analyze needs in camps. In terms of how we provide services, in terms of, as I was mentioning, pre-existing unequal citizenship laws. The most recent UNHCR assessment of citizenship laws shows that 27 countries still have unequal citizenship laws for women. And what that's meaning in some of the countries and regions where this is where this comes together with conflict is it's rendering women and their children stateless. And beyond protection regimes as a result. During return, we see that the lack of pre-existing rights to housing, land, and property rights for women is a concrete obstacle to their recovery. But looking beyond that, if we see what's happening in the camps, the lack of access to education, to health services, to means of livelihood and survival, the short-term obstacles are actually laying down obstacles in the long term for recovery. If we say that the average time for displacement is 17 years, we are losing years of education for young girls. And what does that mean in the long run for women's empowerment and gender equality, for women's participation, and for their ability to recover during the peace-building phase and to lay down the foundations for economic recovery and contribute to the recovery of their countries? So what does all of this mean in terms of what our response is and what it should be? I think the first thing is that we need to look at the Women, Peace and Security agenda in holistic manner. The pillars of prevention, participation, protection, and recovery need to be brought together when it is that when we're responding, in particular, to displacement and refugee situations. On protection, we have to have a holistic response. So in the camps, we have to be looking at access to services, but we have to also be looking at access to justice services for women. We have to be doing the short-term documentation and investigations and allowing women to have access to justice, which also feeds into their security. We have to be looking at access to services that are beyond just the short-term crisis response. As I mentioned, education needs to be a key part of our response, but we also need to look at access to reproductive health care services. We know that the maternal mortality rates in many of these camps are horrific. And this is confounded by the issues of early and forced marriage. Last year, UN Women conducted an assessment of Syrian refugees in Jordan and found that more than a third of girls are married off while they are still children. And this is a rate that's likely to increase as this crisis and the displacement becomes protracted in nature. And we know that this has long-term impacts on girls' health, and on women's lives more generally, that girls who are married off at an early age are obviously more vulnerable to violence. The early forced marriage is a form of violence itself, but they're also more likely to become pregnant at an early age, to suffer consequences and complications as a result of that, and to have higher levels of maternal mortality as a result. So we need to be thinking in the short term, again, about how do we lay down the responses for the long term and the recovery and peace-building phase. And then lastly, I want to just return to the point of, as I said, the changing nature of conflict. And I think this is something that is likely to be highlighted during the Security Council debate this year. And it seems possible that there will be a civil society representative from the Middle East region, and if there is, would likely be speaking about the new threat, the new global threat that is being experienced by IS and the driving of displacement flows as a result of the rise of violent extremism. And I think for UN Women, this is something that we really that we would like to highlight, is the fact that the new threats, the new global threat that we're experiencing in terms of violent extremism is driving displacement flows as well. And we need to think differently about what our response is as a result of this, as a result of what's driving it, and as a result of what women's experiences of conflict and displacement are. And so we're seeing that displacement is being driven not just by the conflict that's happening there, but as a result of the pushback on women and girls' rights, the targeted violence against women and girls, whether it be a pushback on girls' rights to education, in Nigeria, or whether it be a pushback on women's rights generally to public participation, to be part of public life, to own and decide how it is that they dress and what they do with their bodies. That we're increasingly seeing that these are issues that are driving displacement, but are also driving the vulnerability to new forms of violence during displacement. And we need to think differently about how it is that we address this threat. A security and military response alone is never going to address the needs of girls and women who are fleeing violent extremism. And I think if there's one thing that we can look to as common to all of these agendas, it is a pushback on women and girls' rights. And if that is a common thread to the extremist agenda, we have got to ensure that gender equality and women's empowerment and women's rights is a common thread to our mobilization for response. And we will not be able to address women's needs during displacement and flight if we're not looking at the new forms of conflict, the new experiences of conflict, and how we need to be ensuring that women's rights are front and center in our response.
Thank you so much. And we have also a discussant with us today, and I'll go to her immediately, and Christine Erickson, UNHCR New York office. Christine, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And let me first thank IPI and indeed the Permanent Representative of Liechtenstein and for convening this very important event. And as Nala mentioned, we also need to acknowledge the leadership role of the Argentinian presidents of the Security Council this month, all of whom who have showed unwavering commitment to highlight the plight of refugee, internally displaced persons and stateless women and its impact on achieving the objectives of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We heard three interesting and complementary presentations here, and I won't really repeat what was said, except that I want to just highlight a couple of issues from those, and indeed Nala pointed out how important it is to take a holistic approach to displacement, and that is indeed what needs to be done. Hans-Jörg mentioned that we need to change the language and see displacement not only as a humanitarian issue, but also the long-term development, see it as a long-term development issue. With that in mind, I really want to echo from our side as well the importance of including displacement into the post-2015 development agenda. May I also add that in addition to being a humanitarian issue, a development issue, displacement is also a political issue. And actually, to quote a former UN High Commissioner of Refugees, Madame Sadako Gata, who said that for a political problem, there can only be a political solution. So indeed, this is an issue for peace and security, and hence we very much welcome the attention that the issue now is getting in the Security Council. Linking it, of course, in this right now into women, peace and security. Jenny mentioned that women are not heard. And now is the time for us to listen. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what we've actually heard and what we have been doing lately, and also what still needs to be done, and there's a lot that needs to be done. As have been mentioned very much today is the unprecedented increase of displacement. And in fact, we calculated that in 2013, every single day, 32,200 people were displaced by violence of war. That's actually more than double in 2011. And as well, we've already heard that women and girls are deeply impacted by this crisis. For once, they account for about half of the total number of refugees, internally displaced persons, and stateless persons. But they are particularly highly vulnerable because of the discrimination and human rights abuses they have endured prior to displacement, as well as during the displacement. So, in other words, displacement and statelessness will only heighten the pre-existing inequalities suffered by women and girls. Understandably so, a lot of emphasis had been put on sexual violence, which disproportionately affects women and girls. There's also a whole range of violations, other violations that we need to address. Violations of civil and political rights, and here, of course, the right to nationality and equal personal status. Violations of economic and social rights, which are critical in both the emergency and peace-building context, where many households are headed by women. UNHCR has been deeply committed for many years to promote gender equality. And our focus, which is fully in line with both the letter and the spirit of the Security Council Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and the so-called three pillars of prevention, protection, and participation, it has very much been building on women's resilience and strengths, and very much on promoting their participation in all decisions affecting their lives. So we have, for example, supported initiatives to increase women's leadership and participation in decision-making. We've supported livelihoods and access to education opportunities, because we do know and recognize that education is one of the most effective ways to prevent engagement in what would be called negative coping strategies. And this is indeed also forced and early marriages that were mentioned. And more general, of course, this will prove highly beneficial to women's families and communities, both in economic and social terms. We recently launched the Educate Girls social media campaign. And this campaign aims at identify crucial challenges to girls' access and retention in secondary education, based on a figure that only 12% of refugee girls are enrolled in secondary school globally due to economic and social factors. In terms of protection, the issue of civil documentation and of ensuring full compliance with women's rights to personal status and nationality is also one of our key priorities. As an example, in the Republic of Congo, Montenegro, and Mozambique, 100% of refugee women were individually registered and issued identification documents. And this is really crucial, that all refugee IDP women as well are individually registered, because this is what actually helps them gain access to social services and entitlements. On the issue of prevention of statelessness, we have seen actually during the last couple of years a major progress. Although Nala mentioned the 27 countries where there are still inequalities in terms of nationality legislation, 12 countries have undertaken reforms to achieve gender parity in their nationality laws. And we actually launched a campaign to end this discrimination in June 2014, together with the UN Women, academics, and NGO partners. Further on statelessness, on 4th of November, in a couple of weeks' time, our High Commissioner, Mr. Guterres, will publicly launch the global campaign to end statelessness. And this will include a strategy for achieving this ambitious objective within the next decade. We do believe it's possible, but it will depend a lot on the political will. The strategy includes issues like resolving, of course, the existing major situations of statelessness, ensuring that no child is born stateless, and removing gender discrimination from the nationality laws. These are just 3 out of 10 objectives. On the issue of women's access to justice, we have been offering legal services, and something that is very important is that there also are mobile courts. And for example, in Dadaab, Kenya, we have been supporting mobile courts. These, of course, will allow refugee women to seek accountability in SGBV cases, as well as offer medical services to survivors. We've, of course, worked closely in partnership. That is, partnership is really important. We can't do this alone. We actually presented last week the UNHCR Nansen Refugee Award to a Colombian women's rights network, Butterflies with New Wings, Building a New Future. This network is based in Buenaventura, and it's a group of volunteers, and they're risking actually their lives to help survivors of forced displacement and of sexual abuse, and they've been helping over 1,000 women and their families so far. We are committed, of course, to do more. We are fully recognizing, for example, that we should not wait in emergencies until we have the first indications of SGBV. We have to be prepared, and so we have a rather new initiative called Safe from the Start, which is funded by the U.S. State Department, and this will ensure SGB prevention as life-saving intervention from the very onset of an emergency. And we also have just entered into a real-time accountability partnership with USAID, IRC, UNICEF, UNFPA, and OCHA. And this is a test. We are going to test the model response into current crisis uses, and using the results to actually establish benchmarks on accountability. And to conclude, we believe that one of the key issues for consideration by the Security Council with respect to women, peace, and security is that facing serious challenges in provision of protection assistance to our populations of concern. For example, restrictions on humanitarian access, instances of non-refoulement, detention, forced illegal evictions, and transfers, as well as narrow interpretation of refugee and asylum laws. These challenges do directly and disproportionately impact women. So we call on members of the Security Council to take action pursuant to the Council's mandate, to take action to address these challenges and to consider the serious gender dimension. And actually not only under the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a very comprehensive picture of all the aspects of the topic before us. It's clearly not something that should be discussed exclusively in the Security Council. I think that has become very clear in the presentations we've heard from the panel. But it would be useful for us and for the purpose of this meeting if the discussion we're going to have now perhaps does focus on this. I'm of course very happy to hear comments that go into other areas, perhaps in particular on the SDG dimension, which is one of the big challenges we will have ahead of us in the next few months. But if you have comments focused in particular and thoughts that are useful for the upcoming open debate, we would certainly very much value that. If you can briefly identify yourself, perhaps, as you make your question and comments. That would be very helpful for us. So we have a first request for the floor here.
Thank you, Elizabeth Cafferty, Women's Refugee Commission. Thank you, Liechtenstein, for hosting, International Peace Institute, and all our speakers. And Nala, I'm a little afraid that if you ever wanted my job, you could have it at this point. On one hand, I feel like there's little for me to say, but I thought I might comment on two concrete case studies that we were speaking about at the round table this morning. And one was the sort of unprecedented collaboration situation that we've got in South Sudan, with peacekeeping operations working really closely with humanitarian actors, and how initially I don't think that we were really doing a good job, and I say we, the entire community out there, addressing gender concerns and really putting the women, peace, and security agenda into action on the ground. I think that the mandate renewal this summer went a long way to addressing some of those gaps. I think the Gen Cap on the ground helped identify gaps, but I think that it speaks to Nala's point about seeing this as a women, peace, and security issue and not just a humanitarian issue, and how we need to work together. So I don't know, Hans-Jörg, if you want to speak, maybe you could respond to that at all. And then I'm going to squeeze in one other thing, because also we have the mission of Jordan here. And I think we've got another good example out there of a fairly good, I say fairly, because obviously WRC always wants to see things reach a higher standard than they are. But the refugee response out there, gender is being considered, and the programming is more gender responsive than we have really seen in most situations. However, we did an assessment earlier this year, and we did see a gap, which was Jordanian women's rights organizations on the ground, feminist groups. There's a very vibrant sector out there, are actually working a bit outside of our system to provide services to refugees, to women and girls, either provide them or help make referrals. So if anyone wanted to comment on how we could do better going forward and engaging women civil society leaders to reach out and help us find answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we take a couple together and then we go back to the panel. Next speaker. Yes, somebody right up here. Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the panel. My name is Louise Allen. I'm the Executive Coordinator of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. So this panel is very important for us, and we will be feeding in some of the comments into our own recommendations. But we see the open debate on the yearly open debate on women, peace and security as important for two reasons. One, it's a yearly opportunity for everyone to assess the implementation of the full spectrum of the women, peace and security over the last 12 months. And this year, it's also really important for the Security Council to be focusing on forced displacement from a women, peace and security lens. The working group, we're in the process of developing our recommendations, but we'll be putting forward three recommendations, three sort of umbrella recommendations. Some of them you won't be surprised that we'll be putting them forward. But one will be enhancing women's leadership and participation in forced displacement settings, and that covers all settings. The second one will be ensuring gender-sensitive and multi-sectoral responses to humanitarian assistance. And the third is really promoting women's roles and in conflict prevention and conflict in combating violent extremism. And this year is also an opportunity to really lay the groundwork and build momentum for what we see as a very important year for the Women, Peace and Security agenda next year. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, Yael?
I'm Dr. Danieli of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. Interestingly, the word culture was not mentioned in any of the presentation. And I'm wondering how much culture is involved. Take it as even the Security Council culture, or the situation in the 27 countries, etc. How much of culture is involved in the resistance to furthering women's rights and care and children's rights and care in these situations? And do you feel more hopeful than in the past that the Security Council will take it forward?
Thank you very much. Back to the panel. Hans-Jörg, you want to start? You have been asked pretty directly questions.
As already indicated, I don't want to talk about that. No, just look. I wish there was something to take credit for. No, look, I think. I think the final story to be written on what happened in South Sudan is still out there. And I think everyone agrees that the initial reaction was the right reaction, to permit people to come in and around campsites. But I also think this has led to very, very new difficult tensions. And there it's not as if one side is right and the other one wrong. I mean, there are severe implications because of the longevity of this displacement. So it is what you do right now to save people's lives may actually last forever. And I think this forever dimension hasn't been factored in. And I think that is a chronic shortcoming, I would say, and I would, in that sense, include the humanitarian into the peace and security realm. That is a chronic shortcoming of the entire peace and security approach. It is short-term intervention. It's very often meant to be that. It's riding and overtaking political focuses and so on. So what we have right now is a situation where the peacekeepers, and I have all understanding for this, if I was a force commander, would like to see these people slowly migrate off their bases, and what next? So, you look at those people in front of your doorsteps and say, let the humanitarians take care of them. But what are the humanitarians going to do? Return them to the places that they're still under threat and where they're still active fighting? And I think this is where we're trying. There was just a mission, I think, that was referred to earlier, that went out there to talk to the peacekeepers, to look at the humanitarians, who can do what and so on. But I don't think there's an immediate solution to this. And that's why I think, yes, it is a success if you look at the initial protective instinct. Very good. We got that right. How right we'll get that next phase, I think, is still out there, and it relates to that point of longevity of displacement. Perhaps just the second point, and I actually, if that was what you had in mind, I even have the card of this Syrian women's organization, ARDD, or one of them, because I met with them yesterday, and it is remarkable. And the point there is, I think, the one that I tried to make before, on this urban displacement and the connectivity with municipalities. Most of these things take place in municipal environments, and the ones, we call it sort of the host communities. But if you look at it from a more technical level, it's host community doesn't mean anything. It is really the local level that will have to look after the service delivery, will have to accommodate these people, will have to integrate these people. And so the longer displacement lasts in these urban settings, and I think 2/3 or so of all forced displacement is in urban settings. So the longer this lasts, the less it becomes a humanitarian challenge and the more it becomes a socioeconomic challenge. If you look at those issues that I mentioned before, that those women who were in those situations, they didn't talk about when is the next food delivery, when is the next water delivery, and so on. If you go to Kalma camp or Zamzam camp in Darfur, the already years ago, the needs that they formulate are not, when can I go back to, but they say, what, last month we didn't get that service, or we did. It's a service approach. It's a socioeconomic challenge. People want to work, they want to have their children go to school. But collectively, and that's what I mean, it needs to stay, it's not recognized in the, sorry, Christian, I know that Liechtenstein, like many others, I saw Norway before, many others made an effort in the OWG, but it's not understood and accepted as ultimately a long-term socioeconomic challenge. It's not. The narrative is not there, And so the ownership very often of these issues is with the humanitarians. you deal with it. And if you have to do it for 15 years with it, you deal for 15 years with it. That needs to change. And part of the solution is actually that it's not only the municipalities, that many of those services progressively need to be handed over to civil society groups, to the local sector. So that means in our programs that are very often annually, short term, so we raise funds from 1 year to the next. So over 5 years, we raise money for exactly the same issues 1 year after the other. Rather than look at our tools and say, shouldn't we have 3 to 5 year strategic plans? Precisely because displacement is not something that happens this year, happens next year, blah, blah. It is going to be there for a long time. So in a 5-year plan, you can actually make provision to gradually phase certain services out from what we have been doing as humanitarians, first response, to hand it over to civil society groups, to the local municipality, and redirect some of the funding, particularly from development actors, into those longer-term interventions. That's necessary. That's not happening enough. Last point is perhaps on the acceptance. Obviously, culture plays a role into this. But I just really want to, and I'm not suggesting that there was a subcontext to it, but I really want to urge us to not fall into too simplistic patterns. That in some parts of the world where the role of the woman is more threatened than in others, you know what? There are acceptance issues around for refugees and displaced anywhere in the world. In my country, as much as why in the Syria crisis at the highest level of refugees and displacement are so few Western countries willing to repatriate them or relocate them temporarily? Why? For the very same reasons that it happens in the countries right next door. So I'm just saying we need to be a little careful by thinking that we would necessarily be better, because the impact on local communities is severe. But what is interesting is, including on the cultural issues and attitudes towards women, the longer these contexts last, the more acceptance you build. And that is why it is important that, for example, where the role of the woman has changed to becoming sort of a more passively, I have to be careful how I phrase that, but being managed by the male head of the household before, and becoming now the head of the household, having to interact with institutions, having to interact with neighbors and others. That not in the first instance, but over time will change perceptions, will create levels of acceptance that are higher than what we had before. I'm not understating the problem, but I think there are solutions. Chris, I've got to just make a very short point, because I'm not sure I can otherwise make it. We're talking about these problems, and there is no shortage of meetings like this that talk about internal displacement. But you know what? We were talking about it before. We talked about it in OCHA a year ago, that there is a feeling that overall, globally, the temperature and the literacy on IDPs has dramatically dropped. And that, I think, goes to Anne-Christine's point of what Sadako Gata said. What I mean is political problems require political solutions. What I mean is the willingness to programmatically mainstream IDPs in our assistance efforts has not dropped. We're doing a lot, but we're keeping these people alive. So they get too much from us to die or disperse, but there's not enough political investment anymore to actually change anything about their status. And that contributes to that longevity of displacement. And I think that's one area that we need to address, that governments, agencies, all of us have been part of this trend to say, well, mainstream, but we've actually dismantled structures. I can speak for OCHA, certainly, that specifically focused on IDPs, that looked at those status-related issues. Well, that has an impact on the talking points, on how your principal takes issues forward, how you lobby and advocate with member states. So what we need is more attention again to those political status-related issues and who takes those forward, because otherwise all of this will just be, the absence of that is a contributing factor to the longevity and the duration of displacement. And that goes to this point that I tried to make earlier. The Security Council has very rarely almost never condemned forced displacement. It recognizes that that is a feature of the conflict, yes, but it doesn't condemn. There is a thematic resolution on the protection of civilians, 1684, I believe, many years ago, that does exactly this. It condemns forced displacement. But this formulation that the Council has given itself, its established language, hasn't been replicated, except for one or two. I think DRC in Somalia hasn't been replicated in many others. What this leads to is, if you don't make that first step, you don't make the second step. You don't make the step to then say, and the right to return. At the height of the Iraq crisis in the mid-2000s, after 2 or 3 years of lots of resolutions, not the Arab League, not the Security Council, none of these resolutions ever highlighted the right to return. You know what? In Bosnia, it was from the very first day in the Dayton Accords. It was the right to return. There was a political investment. The political discourse was around people have to accept that this return. It may take 5 years, it may take 10 years, it may take 50 years, but you don't give up. You push in that direction. And you know what? Some returns have happened. It's not easy, but returns have happened. So that's why it is important. That's, I think, where we need to nudge and focus the Security Council's attention on. Acceptance of the longevity of the issue, the long-term duration and early solutions, and secondly, to heighten the political investment and attention again on what makes IDPs IDPs. That's not the lack of assistance, that is the lack of status and security around their status, and that requires political investment. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Hans-Jörg. Jenny?
Just to briefly follow up on that point around culture, I mean, I think that's a very complex, multifaceted, multi-layered, nuanced, right, piece. But I want to bring one point out. One of the things we heard from these women and girls is that, they were saying that in Syria they were out at night. They were, working and accessing education because of this conflict that's being taken away from them. So again, I think we have to just really honor and acknowledge the complexity. And what I would say is that the culture shift that has to occur across the board, women and girls at the center. They're at the center of informing services. They are at the center of understanding how to access services. They are at the center of program design. They are at the center of capacity building with local partners on the ground. That's the shift. That's the shift around gender equality, I think. So I think we need to almost flip the conversation around culture and say this is across the board shifting. Whether you're an implementing agency, whether you're a think tank agency, a policy agency, on the ground, CBO, emergency response, it's that kind of powerful shift that has to happen. So I just would offer that as just another perspective on that.
Thanks a lot.
Sure. I just want to pick up where Jenny left off there, talking about a cultural shift, and I absolutely agree. I think it is a cultural issue. It's a patriarchal cultural issue, and we all live in patriarchal cultures to some manifestation, degree, form, and I don't think that, I think that cultural issue is also linked to the issue of extremism at the moment. I don't think that we should name extremism as being linked to religions, because I think it's a political agenda. And these things are identified and defined and evolve according to political agendas. And so, A, I think culture evolves. B, I think it's a patriarchal culture that we all live in that contributes to that. And I would be hesitant to talk about it as being about culture in a different way. But maybe just to say, and Elizabeth, firstly, thank you very much for the encouraging words. I assure you your job is safe. WRC's work is far too important to fall into amateur hands. But I did want to just say to you, I think you were highlighting the issue of civil society, and I think that's something that we haven't highlighted enough. The origins of 1325, Security Council Resolution 1325, was from civil society. And subsequent resolutions have noted the need to focus on funding and investing in civil society. They are the front line, whether it be within flight and displacement, whether it be in conflict countries. They are the frontline response. They are the frontline often in services. They are, for women in particular, they are often the first access points that they have. And I think that we need to highlight more the role of civil society within this issue as well. That also links to another issue area that I think we highlighted, and Jenny, you talked about women's participation and putting women and girls at the center of the response. And I just want to take that from there and say, yes, this is both about programming response and design with regards to forced migration, but we have to place women and girls' participation at the center of all of our peace and security responses, and women's participation in all decision-making forums on peace and security. And I think in the last few months, we have a positive example with the Colombian peace talks. I believe one of the first times that we're having victims taken to talks in order to talk to both sides about their needs for justice, their experiences of conflict, etc. And within the victims group, my understanding is there's been specific women victims of displacement and forced migration who have been part of the peace talks and who have had the opportunity to convey their messaging to both sides in Havana. And I think that's really important. We have to make the linkages that women, refugees, and IDPs are amongst the most excluded when it comes to participation, whether it be in peace talks, whether it be in transitional justice mechanisms, whether it be in peace building and recovery efforts. It's as a relation to the economic exclusions. It's about their physical locality, but it is really it is an exclusion of their participation within the peace and security responses, and we do need to address that, and I think highlight that much more within our response.
Thank you. There were very many good comments already. So, and Nala put it very eloquently here at the end about the exclusion of displaced persons, particularly women and girls from the peace and security agenda. Now, I just wanted to add to Hans-Jörg's point earlier. I think it's important that we also are able to get forced displacement or displacement into the national development plans as well. And just a quick comment in relation to statelessness in the 27 countries, not going into the cultural issue of it, but just to highlight that sometimes it's just a question of getting the attention of the issue to the right people, and it can be just a question of a small formulation that needs to be adjusted somewhere, either the constitution or nationality legislation. It's not necessarily a big issue at all. It's just that it's been marginalized. Let's put it that way. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple requests for the floor in the back. I think you've been asking for the floor, yes.
Thank you. My name is Eugenia Pisa Lopez from UNDP. Thank you very much for a very, very interesting set of presentations. Refreshing somehow. We don't hear patriarchy as a terminology very often in the UN system. It's surprisingly fresh. I have a couple of comments in terms of the recognition of displacement as a long-term issue. I think it's extremely, extremely important that acknowledgement of displacement as a long-term problem is brought into the UN system in two ways. One, in terms of enabling the architecture to respond better. For example, in the case of UNDP, what we have seen consistently is we have a real challenge in operating more fluidly between the UN country team in charge of the more developmental-oriented responses. And I'm sorry I'm speaking a little bit internal here, but I think it's an issue that could and should be part of the UN Secretary General's report. In particular, the need to bring more effectively together the actors that have a depth of experience on long-term development with the actors that have a depth of experience on humanitarian responses. We have tended in the past to look too much at the problems associated with those two actors because of different mandates around neutrality in particular. But I mean, if I think about UNDP as an agency that par excellence tries to build the capacity of local authorities, work with local authorities on service delivery, help national and local authorities integrate better fiduciary decentralization and others, I think it is really, really important that we think of ways in which we want to bring to bear in a response the capacities of the system more effectively. And to me, this is part of the review of the mandate of the missions. The missions mandate rarely, if at all, take into consideration the UN country team, where agencies like UN Women, like UNDP sit. There are agencies like UNICEF that cross between humanitarian and development, but that is not the case for most of other agencies. So in my view, it's not a question of enlarging or cutting down the mandate of agencies in charge of humanitarian, but really looking at how the system bears its response more effectively, more professionally, and more politically committed to those most affected by crisis. And that brings me to the second point, which is the issue of gender-based violence and violence against women in refugee and displaced context. You know, because I'm older than many of you here, I can tell you that this is something we have been talking about for 25 years. We have been talking about the problem of gender-based violence in refugee camps since the mid-80s, when we had the crisis first in DRC. And I really think that we have the person that talk about this phase between advocacy on the one hand and operations on the other, that is exactly part of the problem. I'll give you an example. If we are if the United Nations system is going to enter into a new country with a mission, we have something called an advance team that goes and identifies the issue and decides how the mission is going to be set up. Do we ever send a gender expert in that mission? I don't think so. We continue to respond to this crisis without allocating the resources required to address gender and to give the political weight that gender considerations have to have. And I think that is something member states can really deal with. You know, how the development and the humanitarians interface, and how the gender expertise at the highest level need to be there from the very, very early moments. And the final point is about, which is also an issue that has been raised for many, many years, is how do we build upon the deep expertise of women's organizations on the ground so that they can be better and enabling the United Nations system to deliver services to populations. I don't know why, but women's organizations with a more feminist or women's equality center agenda, however they want to define themselves, are for some reason consistently the type of organizations that are not taken into consideration as program deliverers for the UN system. Of course, there may be exceptions in UNHCR or exceptions with OCHA or exceptions even in UNDP, but it's not the norm. We do not consider in our mandates that actually those who have the expertise on women, peace and security, who are women on the ground and their networks, should be at the forefront of the implementation of the United Nations. And I think it has to do with two factors. The first is there is still a prejudice about the role of these organizations because they focus primarily on political rights of women. And they are not necessarily focusing more on the service delivery orientation. And the second prejudice around that is that we have systems of procurement. This is systems for engaging civil society organizations that prevent us from engaging groups which have less of an institutional makeup, which is more sophisticated. I think we need to really also call for a simplification of procedures so that the UN system can more effectively engage women's organizations in the delivery of services and identification of services. A final point is...
Okay, can you please come to the end of your question, so to speak?
No, it's not a question.
Thank you.
It's a comment. Thank you.
Yes, I noticed there was not. Okay. Does anybody else wish to offer a comment or make a question? Because otherwise I'll go to concluding remarks quickly to the panel. We're rapidly nearing the end of our meeting. Okay. Somebody on the panel? Hans-Jörg?
I think I've had my various opportunities at concluding remarks already, but perhaps just one point on this last point without belaboring another 25-year discussion on the continuum between relief and development, or the many other names that we've given it. But it is interesting, just one or two facts that are noteworthy. The consolidated appeals, these humanitarian appeals that we launch at the end of the year, have risen within the last 10 years from a volume of around $4 billion in 2004. And 2004 was not an easy year. We had the Bama earthquake and Darfur and God knows what. $4 billion. If I asked you right now, other than those working for OCHA, what you think the figure was this year, you would not believe this. It is over $17 billion. So in 10 years, the humanitarian sector, multilateral, has risen by over $13 billion. And that is not because of our fundraising skills. That is because of increasing humanitarian need. And I think the discussion that sort of every once in a while comes up that I think we need to immediately put out is that the humanitarian funding benefits or comes on behalf of developmental funding. That is not true. It is a reflection of needs, and yes, that it may have led to a reprioritization, but the discussion that we're having right now is that the gap between projected needs over the next 10, 15, 20 years and the resources and capacities that we have to have at our hands that are available to us to even respond to those needs is going wider and wider apart. So for me, it is this question of much more creatively take on this debate and say, how can we ensure better connectivity? And for me, again, this goes back to the SDG discussions right now, where there's lots of focus on the goals and the targets, but not, for my taste, enough on the mechanics of all of this. How do these goals ultimately become transformative? How do they make things different? How do they ensure better connectivity? Well, you know what? The tools and mechanisms and arrangements between these communities are very, very different. As I said, humanitarians annually raise money. We have to move to multi-year strategic plans and multi-year funding that connects to UNDAFs and CCAs, whose duration is 5 years. So I would even argue that we don't have really planning tools that actually go over, that achieve a compact of 10 to 15 years sustainable that we can offer some of these affected member states. That says, you know what, we have recognized the problem that in order to return IDPs, you need to strengthen the municipal service delivery sector. But you know what, with annual humanitarian funding, you're not going to make a difference. You make a difference by saying, this is the 10 or 15-year projection. This is going to be a long-term problem. And that's why you need donors, not only on the humanitarian, but on the long-term side, who invest in those capacities and service sectors that actually do the trick. And for me, there's a lot of this discussion that is too much at that policy level still, and the moment you break it down to the operational level and the plan level, it actually starts making much more sense. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hans-Jörg. Jenny?
I mean, I think the only thing I would add there is I agree around the funding cycle in particular, because, you know, a lot of what we're saying, I mean, if we look at domestic violence, for example, you know, that's a humanitarian crisis, and domestic violence exists in many contexts. But we also know that during times of natural disaster as well as protracted conflict, it is exacerbated. And so, you know, to have annual funding around that, I think, I think that there's a whole, there's many pieces to that I think if we were to change the way in which we had our funding cycles, it could make a significant impact. And I think further to the capacity building piece, it's very hard to do capacity building if you're funded for 12 or 18 months. And you know, because you want to both take the mainstreaming approach as well as the technical depth approach. And in order to do that on the ground with local organizations, women's organizations, you have to have a commitment. And when you're constantly in a cycle of having to, so this is coming from the implementing agency perspective, you know, you're constantly chasing that to secure the programs, to secure the capacity building, to secure the partnerships. And so if we really want the longer term results in these protracted situations, I think it's a really important point.
Just very briefly, we've raised a lot of issues here today, all very important, and we really hope that these will get the attention they deserve in the Security Council, not only within the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but also other agendas, and displacement up there at the front. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. Thank you all for coming. Please pay attention to the summary that the IPI will produce. We will try to promote this as widely as possible and to disseminate it in particular to those of you who will also participate in the open debate. We do think that a lot of interesting material has come out in the course of today, including this morning, where I personally did not participate, but that apparently has also been a very good meeting. I also very much hope that this will help a bit in trying to achieve the goal of putting displacement, in particular internal displacement, more prominently on our agenda, because I really think it's very regrettable that this has dropped off a bit of the screen of what we're doing, and I think what we heard today makes it very clear that it is necessary to change that. So thank you all. Thanks in particular, of course, to the panelists. Thanks for being here.